Right now, as you're watching this video, thoughts are moving through your mind. Some of them feel like they're yours. But what if some of them aren't? What if certain thoughts, certain fears, certain sudden waves of anxiety were never actually coming from you in the first place? According to ancient texts, discovered buried in the Egyptian desert in 1945, there are invisible entities that influence human perception and feed on emotional energy. The Gnostics called them Archons, and they believed these beings were not just influencing the world, they were running it. Not through governments, not through armies, but through the most powerful system of control imaginable, the human mind. And once you understand how these entities operate, you'll start seeing their fingerprints everywhere, in religion, in media, in society, and sometimes even inside your own thoughts. Right now, as you're watching this video, there are invisible entities feeding off your fear, your anger, your despair, and your ignorance. They've been doing it for thousands of years. They're not demons in the traditional sense. They're not fallen angels. They're something far more insidious. And according to texts that were buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years, they're the actual rulers of this world. The Gnostics called them Archons, which literally means rulers or authorities in Greek. And what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you see reality itself, because these beings don't just influence world events. They've structured the entire system of physical reality to farm human consciousness, like we're batteries in a cosmic energy grid. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to recognize their fingerprints everywhere, in religion, in government, in media, in the very thoughts inside your head that you think are yours but might not be. And here's the terrifying part. The Gnostic texts that describe these entities in detail were almost completely destroyed by the early Christian church. And when you understand what the Archons are and how they operate, you'll understand exactly why the church wanted this knowledge buried forever. Let me start with what the Archons actually are, because this isn't some vague mystical concept. The Gnostic texts, particularly the Nag Hammadi library discovered in 1945, give incredibly specific descriptions of these beings, their origin, their nature, and their methods of control. According to the text called the Apocryphon of John, the Archons are artificial entities created by a false god called the Demiurge, who himself is a flawed, ignorant deity that I covered in another video. The Demiurge, in his arrogance and ignorance, creates the material universe as a prison for divine consciousness. And to maintain control over this prison, he creates the Archons as his administrators, his prison guards, his agents of control. But here's what makes them particularly dangerous. The Archons don't have divine spark within them. They're not like humans who have a fragment of the true God trapped inside material bodies. The Archons are entirely material, entirely of this lower realm, and because they lack that divine element, they're described as jealous, hungry, and parasitic. They can't create spiritual energy themselves, so they feed on ours. They're psychic vampires on a cosmic scale. Now I know that sounds like science fiction, but let's look at exactly how the ancient texts describe their methods of operation, because it's going to sound disturbingly familiar. The Nag Hammadi text called the Hypostasis of the Archons describes how these beings operate primarily through deception and manipulation. They can't force humans to do anything directly because humans, possessing divine spark, have free will that even the Archons can't completely override. So instead, they manipulate perception, they create false belief systems, they generate emotional states that make humans easier to control, and most insidiously, they whisper thoughts into human minds that we mistake for our own thoughts. The text specifically says that the Archons take forms that are not their own and appear in various forms, and that they cast upon human beings a burden of care and many anxieties by means of the food which they eat. Let me break down what that actually means in modern terms, because it's chilling. The Archons operate by controlling perception and generating specific emotional states. Fear is their primary tool. An anxious, fearful human is easier to control than a calm, centered one. A human lost in worry about survival, about money, about status, about what others think, is a human who isn't questioning the nature of reality itself. So the Archons structure society to generate constant anxiety. Economic systems that keep people in perpetual debt and financial stress. Media that bombards you with threats and dangers 24/7. Social structures that make you feel inadequate and in constant competition. This isn't accidental. According to the Gnostic texts, this is by design. The system is meant to keep you in a low vibrational state, where you're easier to manipulate, and where you generate the kind of energy the Archons feed on. But it goes deeper. The phrase "by means of the food which they eat" isn't just metaphorical. The Gnostics believe the Archons influence what humans consume, both physically and mentally, to keep consciousness dampened. Physical food that's processed, toxic, designed to create addiction and cloud mental clarity. Mental food in the form of media, entertainment, belief systems that keep you focused on the material world and prevent you from looking inward to discover your divine nature. Every distraction, every addiction, every system that keeps you focused externally rather than internally serves the Archons' agenda. Now here's where it gets really disturbing. Another Nag Hammadi text, on the origin of the world, describes how the Archons specifically target human reproduction and sexuality. It says they desire to defile the mingling, and that they want to sow their seed in humanity. Traditional interpretations might read this as simply about sexual immorality, but Gnostic scholars suggest something far more literal and horrifying. The Archons want to influence human genetics and bloodlines to create humans who are more material, more dense, less capable of spiritual awakening. This is why the story of the Nephilim in Genesis 6, where the sons of God mate with human women, takes on new meaning when viewed through the Gnostic lens. Those weren't fallen angels in the traditional sense. Those were Archons attempting to corrupt human genetics to make humanity more controllable. And if you think this sounds too bizarre to be real, consider that modern science has confirmed that human DNA contains sequences that appear to be viral in origin, ancient genetic material from non-human sources that's been integrated into our genome. The Gnostics would say, of course it does, because the Archons have been manipulating human biology for millennia. But the Archons' most effective tool isn't biological manipulation or social control, it's religion. And this is where the ancient texts become absolutely explosive in their implications. The Gnostic text, the testimony of truth, makes an astounding claim. It suggests that the Archons are the ones who authored the religious texts that most of humanity follows. It specifically points to the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, and suggests that this deity who demands worship, who threatens punishment, who requires blood sacrifice, who gets jealous and angry, is actually the chief Archon, the Demiurge himself, writing himself into human scripture as the supreme God to ensure that humans worship their jailer, instead of seeking the true God beyond this material realm. Let that sink in for a moment. The implication is that billions of people throughout history have been worshiping the very entities that imprison them, because the Archons corrupted spiritual teachings at their source. This explains why so many religious systems emphasize external authority, obedience, fear of punishment, and the idea that humans are inherently flawed and sinful. These aren't bugs in religious systems, they're features designed by the Archons to keep humanity in a state of spiritual infancy and dependence. You're told you need a priest to mediate between you and God. You're told you need to follow specific rituals and laws. You're told that direct spiritual experience is dangerous or heretical. All of this prevents you from discovering the truth that the Gnostics taught, that the kingdom of God is within you, that you have direct access to the divine, that you don't need external authority because you are yourself a fragment of the true God trapped in matter. The Archons can't have you realizing that, because the moment you do, their control over you weakens. Now let's talk about how the Archons appear in other ancient traditions, because this isn't just a Gnostic concept. Once you know what to look for, you see descriptions of these entities across multiple cultures and time periods, just under different names. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, there are beings called Asuras, often translated as demons, but more accurately understood as beings who oppose enlightenment and keep souls trapped in the cycle of reincarnation. In samsara, the asuras are described as jealous of the gods and hostile to human spiritual liberation. Sound familiar? They're creating the same kind of prison that the Gnostic Archons maintain in Islamic tradition. There are the jinn, beings made of smokeless fire, who exist in a parallel dimension and can influence human thoughts and perceptions. While not all jinn are evil, the ones called shayatin are specifically described as whispering suggestions into human minds to lead them astray. The Quran even describes Iblis, the chief of the rebellious jinn, as refusing to bow to Adam because humans were made from clay, from base matter, and he considered himself superior. This is the exact same arrogance that the Gnostic texts attribute to the Archons, beings of the material realm who resent the divine spark within humanity. In shamanic traditions across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, there are descriptions of psychic parasites, entities that attach to human energy fields and feed on negative emotions. Shamans perform extractions to remove these attachments. In modern terminology, we might call these entities thought forms or egregores, but the description matches what the Gnostics called archons, non-physical beings that feed on human consciousness and manipulate perception. Even in the Bible itself, if you know where to look, there are references that align with archontic influence. Ephesians 6 verse 12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Rulers, authorities, cosmic powers. The Greek word translated as rulers there is archon. Paul is literally warning about the archons, but most Christians read this passage and think he's talking about demons or Satan in the generic sense. They don't realize he's describing a specific class of entities with specific methods of control. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4 refers to the god of this world who has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Who is the god of this world? Traditional Christianity says it's Satan, but the Gnostics would say it's the Demiurge, the chief archon. And the blinding of minds is exactly the archontic agenda, keeping humanity ignorant of spiritual truth. Now here's where this gets personal and immediate. If the archons exist and operate the way the Gnostic texts describe, how would you recognize their influence in your own life right now? Let me give you some specific markers that the ancient texts and modern Gnostic scholars identify. First, repetitive negative thought patterns that seem to come from nowhere. You're having a good day, feeling peaceful, maybe even having a moment of spiritual clarity, and suddenly a wave of anxiety or self-doubt or anger crashes over you. Where did that come from? The Gnostics would say, check if it's actually your thought or if it's an archontic suggestion being whispered into your mind. The way to tell the difference is this: thoughts that are genuinely yours align with your deeper values and feel integrated. Archontic suggestions feel intrusive, create emotional turmoil, and usually push you toward fear, shame, or desire for external validation. Second, addiction to distraction. If you find it almost impossible to sit in silence, to be alone with your thoughts, if you compulsively reach for your phone, for entertainment, for anything to avoid being present with yourself, that's a red flag. The Archons want you constantly distracted because the moment you turn inward, the moment you start examining the nature of consciousness itself, you begin to wake up. Every app designed to be addictive, every autoplay feature, every notification system, whether intentionally or not, serves the archontic agenda of keeping consciousness fragmented and externally focused. Third, identification with the material body and ego. If you believe you are your body, you are your thoughts, you are your social role, your job, your possessions, then you're fully caught in the archontic illusion. The Gnostics taught that you are divine consciousness, temporarily inhabiting a material form. The body is a vehicle, not your identity. The ego is a construct, not your essence. But the Archons work constantly to make you forget this. They want you identified with the temporary, the material, the separative. because that keeps you trapped in their system of control. Fourth, fear of death. If the idea of death terrifies you, if you can't contemplate mortality without existential panic, that's archontic programming. Why? Because fear of death keeps you clinging to material existence, to the body, to this realm. The Gnostics taught that death is liberation, the soul escaping the material prison and returning to the spiritual realm. The Archons need you to fear death so desperately that you'll do anything to preserve your material existence, which keeps you under their control. Fifth, and this is crucial, resistance to esoteric or mystical knowledge. If your immediate reaction to ideas like what I'm presenting in this video is anger, ridicule, or dismissal without examination, ask yourself where that reaction is coming from. Is it genuinely your critical thinking, or is it programmed defensiveness? The Archons have spent millennia ensuring that certain knowledge is labeled heretical, crazy, dangerous, so that humans will police themselves and each other, rejecting information that could liberate them without even examining it. Now I need to address something important. I'm not saying that everything bad that happens is because of the Archons. Humans have free will, and we make our own choices. We create our own suffering in many ways, but the Gnostic teaching is that the Archons create the conditions, the systems, the belief structures that make certain choices more likely. They stack the deck. They create a game where the rules favor ignorance, fear, and material identification. And most humans play the game without ever realizing it's rigged, or that they could choose not to play at all. So how do you break free from archontic influence? The Gnostic texts are very specific about this, and it aligns with what mystics across traditions have taught for millennia. First, gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge through inner experience, meditation, contemplation, mystical practice that allows you to experience yourself as consciousness beyond the body and mind. The Archons can't manipulate you once you've had direct experience of your divine nature. You can't be fooled by illusions if you've seen through them. Second, emotional sovereignty. Learn to observe your emotions without being controlled by them. When fear arises, notice it, but don't let it drive your decisions. When anger appears, acknowledge it, but don't act from it. The Archons feed on and manipulate emotional reactivity. A human who can feel emotions but not be controlled by them is largely immune to archontic influence. Third, question everything, especially things you've been told are unquestionable. Sacred cows, whether religious, political, scientific, or cultural, exist to prevent examination. The Archons embed control mechanisms in the things we're not allowed to criticize. This doesn't mean reject everything. It means examine everything with genuine discernment, not with program belief. Fourth, reduce input, increase introspection. Fast from media, fast from social interaction, fast from constant stimulation. Spend time in silence. The Archons operate through noise, chaos, and constant external focus. Silence and solitude are their enemies. Fifth, and this is the most important, recognize the divine spark within yourself and within all beings. The Archons' ultimate trick is making you believe you're separate, that you're just a material body, that some people are enemies and others are allies. But if we're all fragments of the same divine consciousness trapped in matter, then division is an illusion. Unity consciousness dissolves archontic control because the Archons can only manipulate through fear and separation. Now, I know some of you are thinking, this sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory. And look, I get it. The idea that invisible entities are controlling reality is a big claim. But consider this, the Gnostic texts describing the Archons were written between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. They were buried around 400 CE, when the Orthodox Church was consolidating power and destroying competing interpretations of Christianity. They weren't rediscovered until 1945. These weren't modern conspiracy theorists making up stories. These were ancient spiritual practitioners describing what they experienced and understood about the nature of reality, and their descriptions map onto experiences that mystics across different cultures and time periods have reported independently. When you have the Gnostic Christians in Egypt, the Buddhists in India, the shamans in the Americas, and the Sufis in Persia, all describing similar entities and similar methods of spiritual liberation. Maybe they're all seeing the same thing from different angles. Maybe there really is a layer of reality that most people don't perceive, populated by entities that feed on human consciousness and work to keep us trapped in ignorance. Modern psychology has even started to validate some of these ideas, though they use different language. Cognitive behavioral therapy recognizes that we have automatic negative thoughts that aren't actually reflective of reality. These thoughts create suffering and limit behavior. Where do they come from? Trauma, conditioning, sure. But what if some of them are suggested by external influences? Jung talked about autonomous complexes, parts of the psyche that seem to have their own intelligence and agenda. He even suggested that some of these might not originate within the individual psyche at all. In his later work, he was exploring the idea that there might be archetypal entities that exist independently of human minds. That's getting awfully close to the Gnostic concept of Archons. Even in popular culture, once you start looking, you see the Archon concept everywhere. The Matrix is a Gnostic allegory where humanity is trapped in a simulated reality, farmed for energy by machine intelligences. The machines in the Matrix are essentially the Archons, and the journey of Neo is the journey of Gnostic awakening. They Live is a film where special sunglasses allow the protagonist to see that society is controlled by alien entities manipulating humanity through subliminal messages. That's the Archons. Countless other films, books, and shows explore this theme, humans realizing that reality isn't what it seems and that invisible forces manipulate perception and behavior. Artists and creatives throughout history have tapped into these ideas, sometimes consciously, sometimes intuitively. But here's what I want you to take away from this. Whether the Archons are literal entities or symbolic representations of control mechanisms doesn't ultimately matter. What matters is that the Gnostic framework gives you a way to understand and resist the systems of control that keep human consciousness limited. If you see fear-based media and recognize it as archontic manipulation designed to keep you in a low vibrational state, you can choose not to engage with it. If you notice repetitive negative thoughts and question whether they're actually yours or archontic suggestions, you can disidentify from them. If you recognize religious or political systems that demand obedience and discourage inner spiritual experience as potentially archontic in nature, you can seek direct gnosis instead. The Gnostic teaching about Archons is ultimately empowering, not paranoid. It says yes, there are forces working to keep you ignorant and controlled, but you have the power to wake up, to see through the illusion, to reclaim your divine nature. The prison only works if you don't know you're in one. The moment you realize the bars exist, you can start looking for the key. And according to the Gnostics, the key was never hidden from you. It's been inside you all along, waiting for you to turn inward and discover it. So let me leave you with this. For the next week, pay attention to your thoughts and emotions. Notice when fear, anxiety, or desire for external validation arise. Notice when you feel compelled to distract yourself. Notice when you identify strongly with your body, your possessions, your social role. And just ask yourself, is this really me? Or is this programming? Is this my divine nature expressing itself? Or is this archontic influence keeping me trapped in limited consciousness? You don't have to believe in literal archons to benefit from this practice. You're simply becoming aware of the mechanisms of control, whether you attribute them to external entities or internalized conditioning. And awareness is the first step to freedom. The Archons, if they exist, have had thousands of years to perfect their systems of control. But they have one fundamental weakness. They can't actually touch your divine essence. They can only manipulate your perception and emotions. The moment you wake up to your true nature as consciousness itself, their power over you evaporates. This is what the church didn't want you to know. This is why the Gnostic texts were buried, because awakened humanity, a humanity that recognizes its own divinity and sees through the illusions of the material world, can't be controlled by external authorities, whether those authorities are religious institutions or invisible archontic entities. You have everything you need to break free. The kingdom of God is within you. The Archons are terrified you'll remember that.